Hello and welcome to TelecomTV. We're here in California, in Santa Clara, in Silicon Valley, and we're at the ETSI NFV ISG. Quite a mouthful. Basically, it's about network functions, virtualization, standardization, the emergence of a sort of controlling normative way in which NFV is going to be applied going forward. Between two stages, phase 1 and stage 2 of NFV, and as we move into that, I'm Martin Warwick and I'm talking with Don Clarke, who is the Principal Architect Network Technologies at CableLabs. Don, welcome. I know I sort of stumbled a bit there because you've been in BT for so long, and we've talked before about your time in BT, that I almost forgot you'd moved to CableLabs, but we can cover that in a moment. Okay. So let's start with this. You have been instrumental in getting together this NFV ISG. You've been there from the start. NFV seems to have come bursting onto the scene from nowhere over the past 2 years. First time meeting was what, half a dozen people in a room somewhere? Almost a classic garage situation, but not quite. And look at it now, as they say. So it's a big deal. So it's evident that NFV is of great importance potentially to the global comms industry. Just exactly what role has ETSI played in the NFV story to date?
So the NFV story began in a car park in California, actually, back here, when I was at Open Networking Summit, and I was there to try and figure out what the software-defined networking people were like and what was this all about. I was invited there by Dan Pitt to attend, and I used the opportunity while I was there to explore with some of the other telco personalities whether a collaboration around NFV would be fruitful for the industry, just testing with them. What I found was that a number of them were more advanced in their lab work than I'd expected. Well, I thought we were pretty far ahead, working with Intel, HP and others. But actually some of them were doing quite complementary work, and some of them actually were quite further behind than I expected, given that they were quite significant laboratory oriented organizations. And with that in mind, it became apparent to me, first of all, that I could explore and we could share some of the perspectives and learning that we had, but also to bring up to the same level of learning some of the other carriers. So with that small group, we agreed that it would be fruitful for us to collaborate, and we built upon that, and several more came on board as a result of some of the contacts that we had through the common vendors and partners. And that culminated in September 2012, actually, when we agreed that we would collaborate under the auspices of ETSI. That was very important because you have to have some kind of defined framework for collaboration. So we did establish the collaboration within ETSI, and as you know, we published a white paper, which I talked about last time, and our first meeting was in January 2013. So only 10 months later, we published the first documents. I think if you look at what's now currently happening in the industry, you'll see that those documents have been extremely influential. So for example, the architectural framework diagram is appearing all over the world in different documents. So I can say with quite a high degree of confidence that we've converged the industry in terms of the topic. We've brought up the industry to a very sophisticated level of awareness, which has been apparent at this meeting, that the quality and the technical depth of the contributions that we're seeing coming in represents clearly in the organizations that are authors of those a significant amount of analysis and translation into implementation. So I think that we've become an ecosystem. We've brought the industry up to a very sophisticated level of awareness of this new topic, and we're now beginning to get really down into the work that's necessary to make these technologies interoperable.
I think it's remarkable that you've been able to achieve that in such a short time span, considering what the history of the industry has been in general and how usually they fight like cats and dogs over everything. So what's it been like trying to sort of focus the attention of everybody on that kind of standards-based, ETSI-based organisation, which is what, an enabler rather than a director?
There are challenges there, for sure, Martin. The standards development ethos is very, very methodical specification work where you generate consensus on line by line on everything that the contributors feel is going to influence their future product roadmaps. So my previous experience of standards has not been particularly positive. In fact, I've founded several groups which have sought to accelerate standards outside of the standards domain and bringing into the standards domain the requirements already agreed. So that's the basis why I felt that founding a collaborative organisation was necessary, but somehow we had to find a way where we wouldn't get bogged down in process. ETSI's been very pragmatic as an organisation in hosting us. The industry specification group idea is very much to let the body find its own way. But there are some rules clearly around consensus building and the need to, for example, elect officials. You can't just appoint them. When you come from an environment where you're used to appointing people, to have them voted in by democratic process is on the one hand self-evidently fair, but then in the other hand it's ruled by the mob. So it's like you have to basically use the process intelligently. And what I've found over the last 2 years is that those who deserve to be in positions of leadership soon make themselves apparent to the audience by their contribution, by their way they conduct themselves in these forums. And there are individuals that we can see through the contribution very, very powerful. Now, I would never have been able to access those individuals from just within one organisation. So the collaborative environment we've created under the auspices of ETSI is the most powerful thing that I've seen in my career. However, we now need to turn some of this work into implementation, and that's what the next stage of challenge for the ISG is, to not be tempted to go too far into specification and to do more work around the enablers for implementation. And that's where the open source communities and the implementation efforts within the different organisations will be very key.
I must say, having been set foot and poked my head around a few doors and sat in the back, not at this particular event, but at previous events that you and I have met at, the discussions behind closed doors, shall we say, are robust and frank from time to time. Not entirely what I expected and what I'd been used to, having been around the industry for quite a long time, but not in anywhere which is quite as detailed as that. It was absolutely fascinating to see it. But it's great that it's all coming together. One question I have further for you, though, Don, is it's frequently emphasised that for NFV to be successful, it's going to have to be open in the broadest sense possible. Do you think that's possible? Because look at the history of what we've seen in the IT and telecoms industry, not necessarily in mobile, I grant you there's a difference there, but we've seen so many de facto standards arriving, coming from manufacturers who are pushing their own boat out all the time. How are we going to avoid going through that same old loop again? It's not obvious to me that we can achieve it readily openness in the way that we envisaged in the original white paper. That's not. The industry itself is a dynamic you don't control, and I think that the key to it is to have the enablers for it, but also energise those. So in the architectural framework that we published, there are a number of interfaces that are called out in that, and the amount of work that's gone in to define the requirements for those interfaces has been incredibly intense, and some of the world's best engineering expertise have been applied to those to actually set the requirements. But actually to implement software that actually defines those interfaces is the key to openness, because in the architectural framework we've outlined a number of domains that map to future products from the vendors. And in the old world, the whole framework would have been provided to you by one extremely capable vendor. Yeah. No doubt at all that the telecoms world has been built on that model very successfully. But in the new world, the world where consumption of media and content and business services over smart devices, that isn't the world that we had 20 years ago. It's a very different world. Absolutely.
And the ambition that I have is that we are able to engineer networks that can self-adapt, be automated in ability to respond to the changes of the marketplace. That means you can't do that by specification and diktat. So what we're trying to do is to say, okay, These interfaces are the ones that will enable you to build networks that are flexible and software enabled in the way that we envisaged in the original white paper. But getting those interfaces specified is the key to progress. There's two approaches for that. One is to actually try and specify them. And in the telco world, that has proven to be a very long-winded process. And we will not do that within the ISG except to the level necessary to achieve interoperability. So we look to the open source dynamic to also point the way. So in the software world, open source development is absolutely a well understood methodology, software development methodology. So the challenge actually is to apply software development methodologies to network engineering. And that's the discipline that we are all learning how to do. And in my mind, prototyping those interfaces is probably the way to move forward. Prototyping them not within a proprietary environment, but an environment which allows vendors to work together, one end of an interface and another at the other end of the interface, and then prove that the interface is interoperable through open source software development, but with the requirements and the parameters that get passed across those interfaces being in some way specified here in the ISG.
We know a lot about the potential benefits of NFV, they're self-evident. But what about the barriers to its implementation and adoption? We know there are some. Can you tell us what they are and how they can be overcome?
I think the biggest one is complexity. This is new stuff, right? This is software network engineering. It's not putting a box in a rack. It's turning up a virtual machine, loading the virtual network functions, connecting them together in a software environment. That's not the same as cabling boxes. So in my mind, the biggest barrier is actually just network engineers need to somehow mesh with software engineers. And that's literally bringing together the IT industry and the network industry. And that is the key. But there are organizational barriers to that. So I would say that they are skills, their organization, and they are coming up with the product visions for service providers that will drive those organizational skill changes. And I think that the network engineers, in my long experience, network engineers have usually justified a new network technology on the basis of their own predictions of consumption. So for example, in my previous history as an optical access guy, and then after that I became a copper access guy, in that order, was all about what would drive investment in access networks if it wasn't to do with consumption of bandwidth, right? Yeah. So we in the networks domain actually put forward scenarios to products people about what would drive bandwidth so that we could then get them to demand deployment of access technologies, right? So that was a pretty simple game to play,
yeah.
But the numbers were huge, right? I mean, access deployments cost billions of dollars. You need footprint.
Yeah.
In this world, you can move with NFV in very small digestible pieces. So in my previous role, we focused on enterprise CPE as being one which was very easy to digest because it didn't need big systems changes. It was mainly process changes, and the benefits were service acceleration rather than CapEx and OpEx. So I think that it's the challenge is really to find the product proposition that can get get you to drive an NFV organizational change based on that monetizing or getting the business benefits of that. And I think it's really the challenges are organizational, they're skills, but they're also product vision. Having a product vision that will drive those networks people and those IT people to work for you.
Good answer, I like that. Back to ETSI briefly, if we could. So this will be, when this weekend, it'll be the end of the 7th convocation of the ETSI NFV ISG. What's next for NFV and what's next for ETSI in this regard? Is it time, do you think, or is it inevitably going to happen that ETSI will continue in the role it's in at the moment, being this honest broker and enabler and bringing everybody together in the same tent, as it were? Or do you think the time is going to come fairly soon when the vendors and manufacturers will go their own way and run with what they have, and ETSI will take over more of a sort of an oversight godlike role, peering down now and again and patting them on the head and saying, yes, you're doing fine, or I wouldn't do that if I were you?
I will say it's a good question, Martin. The next phase of the ISG, when we set out on this journey, I deliberately set a target of 2 years to sunset the forum. In fact, I even used the word sunset the forum. And that's because I was determined that we wouldn't create something that by some with self-motivated means justified its existence forever, right?
Yeah.
So I'm still concerned that we don't create something which generates a life of its own for its own purpose, that we serve, and then it dies just because people don't want to go there anymore. So it's expensive to travel. Yeah. People come here from all over the world, and they've got to feel that it's a useful thing to do. So that's the thing to do. I think the second stage, and yes, we are going to extend beyond 2 years, and that was approved in the plenary yesterday. So yes, another 2 years is certainly on the cards. And then last night we were discussing exactly what would this body be doing. So we approved a mission statement, and in the mission statement it has some very important principles. And the most important principle is interoperability. So for NFV to realise to deliver our vision, you want best-in-class components to be assembled from wherever they come from. Yeah. And in today's world, that comes from an open innovation ethos. Yep. And open innovation is in my blood. Bringing together the best in the world at any particular point in time, bring them together. So that means we need to be interoperable across those interfaces that I mentioned earlier on. So to determine interoperability, we're not quite done in terms of some of the specification work, because the requirements aren't fully documented across those interfaces. The challenge will be to know when to stop, but more importantly, we actually feel that we're ready to implement, right? I said we've been ready for a while. The proof of concepts, 23 now in progress. When we started with the proof of concepts, there was about 3 months we had none. And Pradeep said to me, Don, great idea, but there's no POCs. And I said, trust me, they will come. And sure enough, with 23, and I think another 2 have been put in place today. So we are great. But that's not the answer. What we want is a more directed effort to interoperability, which is to say that the ISD itself can act as an enabler for interoperable activities to take place. Right. Now whether that means Plugfest, whether it means listening to teams that are working on implementation, feeding back to us gaps where they can't reach agreement within their group, or they have reached agreement with their group, but the agreement needs to be propagated more widely, then that's where the ISG will come into play. And the specs will then develop only to the point at which the industry then becomes free to go away and start to build these things. And eventually, in terms of maintenance of those interface specs, it depends where they're developed. If they're developed within an SDO environment, or elements are, then they need to be maintained for the long term, clearly, and that's where standards development organizations come into play. Sure. Or if they're open source projects, they need to live as far up into the core of the open source project as you can get it in order to have a permanent life in the open source community. Exactly. And then feeding up into those communities the innovations that are generated through deployments. So, so that's where, in my new role, we're going to be very much focused on that.
Well, you said it was a good question. It was also a very good answer, Don, I must say. It was very, very well articulated, if I might say that. Final thing to you, which you've not talked about. You were at BT for a long time, back in Blighty, and you've moved on, and you still have your engagement with the NFV, ISG, and everything else, but you moved on to CableLabs. So what's the change like? I'm not going to ask you why you went, because there can be all sorts of myriad of reasons for that. But what's the perceived difference now?
So I spent 41 years at BT in
I didn't want to say that.
Mostly people are surprised when they say that. You're that old, Donald. 41 years is a lot. All of that in R&D, incredibly rewarding career that I had in BT. I felt that the United States beckoned. My wife says I only married her because she was American and I only wanted to come to America. It's not quite true. So we were childhood sweethearts, but that's another story. But I felt that I'd done what I could inside that environment, and the team is going from strength to strength without me. But I also was attracted by the idea of a new industry, the cable industry. I've always admired the cable industry for their down-to-earth approach. And
literally and metaphorically.
Down-to-earth approach. They're very focused on stuff that works in the ground, and the innovation environment within CableLabs is unique in the world. And I encourage you to go and look at it one day and cover it as you've done with some of the others, because CableLabs is where DOCSIS originated.
Right.
So a very capable and evolved platform. But also the open innovation ethos that CableLabs represents is very exciting to me. And our focus is actually on prototyping. So we are prototyping today already, and we're demonstrating next week our first NFV prototype that was been developed in just a few weeks, entirely in-house, but we are constructing in collaboration with vendors to build upon that, very much focused on openness. So the outputs from the project will be published work and open source code. So for us, we are going to be an engine, or my ambition is that we become an engine to drive NFV capability for the cable industry and also for the wider industry, because we'll contribute our insights into open source projects for everybody to use. And that's different from the environment to which I've come from. This is very much an open environment where collaboration is published for the wider benefit, not just of the cable systems operators, but also for the world to use as well. And I've been able to transition my role inside the ISG. The Network Operator Council kindly re-elected me to be the chair. So I continue in my leadership role within the ISG, and effectively that means I'll stick around a bit longer to see the thing to a fruitful conclusion, I hope.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. Don Clarke, as usual, thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Martin.